the NCRI, this is the first project I did with them, produces an analysis finding that the far left groups were exploiting the earnest commitment to anti-racism or the social justice on the part of people justifiably upset about George Floyd's murder and the implications about that for racism beyond that. But these far left groups were exploiting that to both gin up supporters and to mobilize online. This is all occurring on social media to capture protests, to ratchet up and inspire more aggressive violence at the protests.
So the podcast today took a turn back to the psychological, which is an improvement over the political, as far as I'm concerned, generally speaking. Likely because the topic of concentration has more long-lasting significance, all things considered. So in any case, I spoke today with Lee Jussim, and Lee is the distinguished professor of psychology at Rutgers, and he's been the chair there of the Department of Psychology and separately of anthropology, which is a peculiar happenstance that we discuss in the podcast. I was interested in Lee's work because there's a lot of trouble in the field of social psychology. A lot of the claims of the field are not true. Now, you got to expect that in scientific inquiry because a lot of the things we believe are false, and the whole reason that we practice as scientists is to correct those falsehoods. And it's also the case that much of what's published is not going to be true because the alternative would be that everything that was published was a discovery that was true, and we'd be overwhelmed by novelty so fast that it would be untenable if that ever happened. Lee is one of the rarer social psychologists who's actually a scientist, and he's done a lot of interesting and also controversial work. That's partly how you can tell it's interesting and valid, because it also is controversial. One of the things he's established, which is of cardinal importance, is that our perceptions of other people are not mostly biased, right? The contrary claim is rather preposterous, which is that all of the categories that we use to structure our interactions with other people are based on the power distortion of our perceptions, let's say, which is essentially a Marxist and postmodern claim. And Lee became infamous, at least in part, because he showed that our perceptions, our stereotypes, if you will, are mostly accurate. There are sources of bias, and they do enter into the process, and they're relevant. But that's a very different claim than that the foundations of our perceptions themselves are indistinguishable from the biases we hold as motivated agents. And so his work is extremely important. It's core to the culture war that is tearing us apart. So if you're interested in the definition of perception, the relationship between perception and reality, and the analysis of bias in a manner that's credible, then pay attention to this podcast and get things cleared up. So I guess we might as well get right to the point. And the first thing I'm curious about is, and this is something I think that can be like fairly definitively laid at the feet of social psychologists, was that there was an absolute denial that anything like left-wing authoritarianism existed, even conceptually, literally until 2016.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like
for 60 years.
I came across that and I thought, well, what do you mean there's no such thing as left-wing authoritarianism?
We know there.
It's like, that's insane.
It's
that's
insane.
Absolutely insane.
It's insane. Yeah.
And then there were a couple of papers published in 2016 on left-wing authoritarianism in the Soviet Union. And that was the first breaking of that dam. I did a master's. I supervised a master's thesis at that time. It was a very good thesis on left-wing authoritarianism. And because we showed that there were statistical clumps of reliably characterizable left-wing authoritarian beliefs that did in fact associate statistically, and that identifiable groups of people with identifiable temperamental proclivities did hold.
Right.
I really wanted to follow up on that because it was very rich potential source of new information, but my academic career exploded at that point. It became impossible. So,
people have taken that ball and run with it. So,
yeah. So, tell us about it. What have you found?
Okay.
How do you? Let's start with some definitions.
Yeah.
Like, what constitutes left wing as opposed to right wing authoritarianism?
Right.
Let's say.
Right. So, there are measurement issues across the board, but that is with respect to both left and right wing authoritarianism. There are questionnaires, commonly used questionnaires to assess right wing authoritarianism and to assess left wing authoritarianism. They're different. The reason, let me give a little context. For a long time, people tried to develop nonpartisan authoritarianism scale, as if authoritarianism was a psychological construct rather than a political one.
Right.
And they couldn't really do it because one of the core toxic elements of authoritarianism is a motivation to crush, deprive of humanity and human rights one's political opponents. So you need to assess either right or left-wing authoritarianism vis-a-vis the attitudes towards one's opponents in order to measure the construct. Okay.
Right, so that's a very interesting definition, though, because you're pointing to the fact that arguably, and tell me if you think this is right, the core of authoritarianism, which, as you said, can't be measured outside the political, isn't precisely political. It's your attitude towards those who don't agree with you.
Yes, it is.
But you have to have some beliefs for that.
I didn't say can't. I say they have not succeeded. Actually, one of my current graduate students is, for her master's thesis, in the process of trying to develop a nonpartisan authoritarianism
based
scale.
on that idea.
Yes, based on that idea. Well, I don't know if she's going to succeed.
I'm thinking about that clinically. It's like, well, that's where you'd start to look at overlap between cluster B personality psychopathology, narcissism, borderline personality disorder, histrionic, because those are the people who are very likely to elevate their own status at the cost of other people, including their children, and those they purport to love.
So the first step to do that is to develop scales that survey questions that adequately get at left or right-wing authoritarianism, and then correlate them with things measuring narcissism or sadism or whatever. People have done that on the left, and it does correlate with left-wing authoritarianism. I don't know, you never know for sure the limits of your own knowledge. So I don't know if anyone has even tried to do this on the right, or maybe they have, and it doesn't actually correspond with narcissism on the right. It corresponds with other things on the right, but not so much with, if there's evidence on narcissism correlating with right-wing authoritarianism, I don't know it.
In the beginning was the Word. Christ is a master at using short, mysterious stories. They change the listener who takes them seriously. My experience with the biblical text is that they're inexhaustible sources of wisdom. If I find something in them that is an obstacle, it's because there's something in me that has yet to be transformed. I just don't get it.
The person that you do not think could ever be virtuous, oh, let me show you. This is the person who is fulfilling the law and the prophets.
But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you as well.
I don't believe in that promise. I'll just be honest at this point. That has not been part of my experience.
This parable I've been trying to understand forever. While we were talking and while we were sitting there, then it hit me. I saw it.
Name me one ideology that has supplanted Christianity that has done good for humanity. This Jew is very frightened of a post-Christian society.
He was the God man, the model, the example of what we ought to become and what we can become.
It's okay. It's safe for you and all of your doubts and apprehensions to open up and to let these stories in.
He is the temple. He is the Torah. He is the covenant. He is prophecy fulfilled.
If you're doing this and it isn't also the love of wisdom, it's also an attempt at wisdom without love. In both ways, you're going radically wrong.
Power of love. It sounds so cliche when you say
60s, eh? I don't want to be on a Hallmark card, I tell you.
We've got our work cut out for us, gentlemen. This is one peculiar time and one peculiar text, and I sure hope we're up to the task.
Nothing at the moment comes to mind. I have a memory of something associated with that because I've tried to follow the literature, but I've definitely seen it emerge on the left.
Yeah.
Correlations on the right. Well, from what I remember, and I'm vague about this because I can't give you sources, is that dark tetrad traits stand out quite markedly as associated with authoritarianism. And I thought that was somewhat independent of whether it was left or right. But I can't provide the sources out there.
Yeah, and I
review them in this new book I wrote on We Who Wrestle with God. There's a lot of reference to the dark tetrad personality constellations and the political manifestations.
Yeah.
But you've been studying it. Okay, so when we looked at the way we developed our measure, because I'd like to know how you developed yours, is we took a very large sample of political opinions and then factor analyzed them to find out if we could identify first clumps of left-wing and clumps of right-wing belief, which you can clearly identify, and then to look within the left-wing constellation to see if there is a reliable subcategory of clearly authoritarian proclivities. And we found the biggest predictor of left-wing authoritarianism was low verbal IQ. It was a walloping predictor, negative 0.40, immense predictor.
Yeah.
So that's something to because one of the things we talked about at the beginning of the podcast was that some of these ideas sound good in the absence of further critical evaluation. Then you might say, well, if you lack the capacity for deep verbal critical evaluation, what apparently moral ideas would appeal to you? And well, you could imagine that there might be a set of them, and one of them would be, well, don't be mean to people who aren't like you, which is a perfectly good rule of thumb.
Yes,
but that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that everyone who says that's what they're for are in fact agitating on behalf of that principle.
Absolutely.
Okay, so back to your research.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, let me be clear. We're other than my student Sonia, who is trying to develop a nonpartisan authoritarianism scale, the work that we have done using either left-wing or right-wing authoritarianism scales are scales developed by other people. We haven't developed the scales. So for left...
And do you think there are good scales now for left and right-wing authoritarianism? Adequate scales?
Adequate for right, yes, and pretty good for left. Even though the research on left is much more recent, you might think it would be therefore less well established. There's two teams, one led by Luke Conway and a different one led by Tom Costello, have done a lot of very good, both psychometric, sort of statistical assessment of how things hang together, and also validity assessment of their two slightly different, somewhat different scales.
You can tell if someone's belief is part of a set of identifiable beliefs if they hold that belief, the fact they hold that belief predicts reliably that they hold another belief, right? And then you want to see a pattern like that emerge across a lot of people. Then you see that there are associations of ideas, right? Those would be something like the manifestation of an ideology. You want to see if that's identifiable, what its boundaries are, that it can be distinguished from other clumps of ideas, so left could be distinguished from right. This can all be done statistically and very reliably. Right. Now, it wasn't done by social psychologists from the end of World War II till 2016. Right. Shameful lacuna in the history of political analysis within the psychological community. It shocked me when I first discovered it.
Me too.
It was shocking. Really?
But talk about blind spots.
Oh my God. It's like, do you guys miss Mao and Stalin?
I know, right. How do you miss that?
How do you miss that? It's like, it's fairly obvious.
And then
you're
they're denied
social psychologist, the biggest social movements of the biggest pathological social movements of the 20th century had their existence denied for 70 years.
Right.
Mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling.
It just, I've never recovered from discovering.
Yes.
It took me like a year to even believe it was true. Okay, so you're using other people's questions.
Yes.
So what's your approach? How are you
Well,
investigating
it
this?
does depend on the study. So this is one good one that I think I can describe shortly, quickly. We administered cartoons, like political cartoons, as if they were memes, like social media memes, to an online sample, about 1,000 people, and asked them how much they liked the cartoons and memes, and we told them to vote for their favorite, because the one that received the most votes we would actually post on social media. Now, that was a lie. It was deception, and we explained that at the end. But we wanted them to believe that when they were selecting something, that this was as close as we get to a behavior. It was close to them posting it. They believed their vote could influence what would be posted.
Right. So it was a real-world outcome.
A real-world quasi-behavioral.
That would be promoted.
Rather than just like liking or disliking.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So,
or self-report that they believe something.
That's right. So I'm going to describe two of the cartoons, which were quite a contrast to each other. We actually had a set kind of like the first and a set like the second.
Okay.
But I can describe the two quickly enough. The first was actually a political propaganda cartoon from the Soviet Union. We didn't tell them that, from the 1930s, 1940s, anti-American propaganda. But we didn't tell them that. We just presented the cartoon, which showed a long-distance shot of this. In the top panel was a long-distance shot of the Statue of Liberty. The bottom panel was a close-up of her head and her crown, and the spires of the crown were KKK members. People dressed in KKK, whatever.
Right.
Thing, right?
So the true nature of American liberty.
American liberty
so that's
is
a power reference.
It's
typical Marxist trope.
Yes, right, okay. That was one.
Yeah.
And then the second was an image of a diverse group of people, different racial and ethnic groups, wearing clothes for different professions. So it might be a bus driver or a businessman or a secretary or a teacher or whatever. There were a whole bunch of different kinds of people in obviously different roles, kind of in a crowd with their arms around each other under an American flag. Sort of pluralistic diversity. That's kind of a humanistic form of diversity. And then we simply ask people, we ask them, which ones do you like the most? Which ones do you want to share on social media? And
So was that a benevolent left view and an authoritarian left view?
Yes,
that's
exactly. Right. That's right.
Demonizing
America versus
we did find in our analysis that there's a liberal left that's clear, and there's a authoritarian left, and the liberal left. This is part of our investigation. The liberal left isn't. Now, did we figure that out? The liberal left doesn't partake of the attitudes of the radical authoritarian leftists. But they're the ones that I also think that the
sort of oblivious
denies. Yeah, they're oblivious.
Yes, I think that's true. That is what we found. That's what we found in the study.
I got a research idea.
Yes.
That's relevant to this. Well, with regards to these questionnaires, it's something that I wanted to do. The large language models track statistical probability. So you can take those left-wing questionnaire sets and you can ask ChatGPT, here's an item or here's 3 items, generate 30 more. And it does it.
Yeah.
Right. So if you wanted to improve the statistical reliability of the measures, so you can imagine, take the measures that already exist, put them in clumps of 3 in ChatGPT, have it expanded out to like 300 items, administer it to 1,000 people and distill it. Because
that's a great idea.
This will speed things up radically, because the thing about the large language models is they already have the statistical correlations built in. When you ask ChatGPT to generate 40 items that are conceptually like these 4, that's what it does.
Yeah.
It's not an opinion.
So you
can use ChatGPT to purify the questionnaires, and you can do that on the left and on the right. And it takes like 10 minutes instead of 2 years.
I'm going to bring this back to Sonia.
Yeah, so
this
do
is great.
Do that and tell me.
Sonia's a fan of your podcast. I'm sure she's going to see this.
Okay.
I'll probably talk to her before, but hi, Sonia.
Yeah, we should be doing this with all the questionnaires. Like it's the same with narcissism. If you see, the other thing you could do with ChatGPT is you could say, here's 20 items significant of narcissism. Okay. Which is the central item? And can you generate 20 items that are better markers of that central tendency? And the thing is, it can do it because it's mapped the linguistic representations.
Yeah.
So all the factor structures already built into the ChatGPT systems, like all
that's great.
of it.
That's great.
Yeah. So okay. So this is one of the things I would pursue if I still had a research lab, right? These things are hard to pursue without having that infrastructure in place. Yeah. But I think this radically
speed up the
radically speed up the process of
I totally see
and
that.
also make it much more reliable and valid.
Yeah.
Right. So
I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll have to try it.
Yeah. Try it out.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So back to
All
right. So now you've got people voting for one comic or the other.
And it was exactly as you described before we went down the large language model path, that liberals who are not, so we use statistical regression, we can separate out being liberal but not authoritarian from being a left-wing authoritarian but not liberal.
Yeah.
Liberalism predicted endorsement of the sort of humanistic diversity image.
Right,
the people together under an American flag. We're all different, but we're all in it together. We love America, blah, blah, blah. It was left-wing authoritarianism powerfully predicted endorsement of the Soviet propaganda. The Statue of Liberty is KKK.
And so the questionnaires predicted that.
Yes.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah. It's a great study. So
another thing you might want to do is take that questionnaire, do an item analysis with regards to preference, and rank order the items in terms of their predictive validity in relationship to the cartoon, because you might be able to see which of the items are central. Especially if you saw that pattern across multiple cartoons. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so that's one. That's we do this kind of thing.
Well, how many studies have you done now on left-wing authoritarianism?
Well, it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot, and we include it in almost everything. We include measures of left and right-wing authoritarianism in most of the studies we've been conducting.
Right.
So
tell us more.
Okay. Well, so the most recent splash. And I think that's what got your staff member interested in having me on here, were 3 experimental studies assessing the psychological impacts of common DEI rhetoric and pedagogy.
Right.
And we did it with 3 different kinds of DEI.
Yeah, those
rhetoric.
are probably studies that I'd run across of yours. I remember that.
Yeah, that's well, it's this fairly recent, and they've made more of a splash than I would have expected.
Well, it's one thing to say that DEI programs work. It's another thing to say they don't work, and it's a completely different thing to say they do the opposite of what. That's not good, and it seems to me highly probable. So suicide prevention programs, the kind the government's always running, they make suicide rates go up. Well, because why? Well, you're advertising and normalizing suicide, right? And you think, well, we're going to put up a prevention program. It's like, first, are you clinically trained? Second, did you do the research? Third, did you ever stop to consider that your conceptualization of the problem might be inadequate in relationship to its solution? There's so many things like this that happen. Clinicians have become, the research-oriented clinicians have become very, very sensitive to such things, because it's frequently the case that a well-meaning intervention will make things worse.
Right.
Okay. And then you might ask why. It's like, well, there's 50,000 ways something could be worse, and like one way it could be better. And so it's an overwhelmingly high probability that whatever you do to change something that works makes it worse. Right. Okay, so what was your evidence that the DEI interventions what was made worse? What interventions, and what was your evidence linking them?
Yes, okay, so let me qualify this a little bit. We examined the rhetoric that is common to many DEI interventions.
ChatGPT can do a very good job of that, by the way.
Kind of. The problem is a lot of the materials used in DEI trainings aren't publicly available. So it's actually hard. And we can say they're common to things we had access to, but we don't, a lot is not publicly available.
Okay, so where
and
do
that's
you
an important
find it?
limitation. Well, hold on.
Yeah,
That's an important limitation that your listeners, viewers should understand. It's not like we evaluated the effectiveness of the DEI training program instituted by the HR department of the city of Milwaukee. We didn't do that. We took the intellectual ideas from 3 different kinds of sources: anti-racism rhetoric, anti-Islamophobia rhetoric, and anti-caste, the Hindu caste system, anti-caste oppression rhetoric. And there are, for race, we used passages from Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and from D'Angelo's White Fragility. These books were widely required throughout colleges. There's sometimes, she is paid $40,000 a session to come in and give her training. So we also actually used this sort of large language model, sort of language network analysis to examine the extent to which this type of rhetoric was common throughout the training materials we had access to, and it was very common.
Yeah, okay, fine. So you use that as a validation.
Yes. You know what, I have on my phone, so I have this here. So let me give an example from the race, and this is just a short excerpt. So people would read, say, an anti-racist passage or a control passage. The control passage in these studies, in 2 out of the 3, was about how to grow corn on the farm. It was completely separate. And this is only a short excerpt of a longer passage.
Yeah, okay.
This is the anti-racism. White people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview. Racism is the norm. It is not unusual.
Okay.
So this went on for a full paragraph. And it was quotes smoothed together with a little writing by us of Kendi and D'Angelo.
Yeah,
okay. All right. So they then were presented with a very brief scenario in which a college admissions officer interviews an applicant, and ultimately the applicant is rejected from admission.
Okay.
That's the whole scenario.
Yep.
I mean, the words are slightly different because I'm doing that piece from memory, but that's basically the whole scenario. They were then asked a series of questions assessing how much perceived racism and bias was
the causal factor.
Yeah. What, on the part of the admissions officer. Okay. And what we found is when they got the Kendi D'Angelo essay, they claimed to have seen or observed the admissions officer committing more microaggressions, treating the applicant more unfairly, and that the admissions officer was more biased.
As Christmas approaches, there's a beautiful opportunity to keep God at the center of the season through Hallow, the #1 prayer app. They're launching a special Advent prayer challenge called For God So Loved the World that promises to be a transformative spiritual journey. This challenge features an incredible lineup of guides. Survivalist Bear Grylls and Jonathan Rumi from The Chosen will lead you through a severe mercy, a powerful story of faith and divine love. You'll join Pastor Francis Chan and Jeff Cavins for profound scripture reflections, while actor Kevin James explores the spiritual classic Divine Intimacy. The experience is enriched with beautiful Advent music from award-winning artists including Gwen Stefani, Lauren Daigle, and Matt Maher. It's more than just daily prayer, it's an invitation to experience God's love, mercy, and healing in a deeper way. Don't wait. Get 3 months of Hallow free at hallow.com/Jordan. Make this a time of putting God at the center and experience the good that comes from it. That's hallow.com/Jordan for 3 months free.
Okay, so I'm going to put on my devil's advocate hat.
Yes.
And I'm going to play Robin D'Angelo, despite wearing this Trump badge. And I'm going to say, well, the effects of institutional racism are so pervasive that they even invaded your experimental material. And the consequence of being exposed to the contents of my writing, speaking as Robin D'Angelo, was that the scales fell from the eyes of your experimental subjects and they were able to perceive the racism that we claimed was there in a manner they couldn't before.
Yes, that is probably what D'Angelo would say. Actually, I can tell you a little bit what Kendi did say because he was asked about it. He did not say that. If someone said that, I would say, well, in our scenario, none of that was evident. You had to read that into the scenario. And that is the point.
How do you know that your own implicit bias didn't stop you from seeing the bias that was there?
Because anyone can look at the scenario. People didn't even have racial information about the admissions officer and the applicant. So
you regard it as highly improbable that what they were reading into the situation, you regard it as highly probable that they were reading into the situation. Okay, let me ask you a couple more technical questions.
Yes.
Okay. How much of this material were they exposed to before they did the evaluation?
About a paragraph.
Oh, just a paragraph.
Just a paragraph.
How soon before the evaluation?
Pretty soon.
Okay. Do you have any idea what the lag time, like if you did a dose response study, so to speak?
Yeah.
Like, is there a decay? Like how permanent are the effects? I know I couldn't expect you to do all that in one study, but it's germane, right?
Yeah. It is kind of. So on the narrow issue of how long do the effects we observed in this study last, we didn't study that.
Right.
So I have no answer to that.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. But given that we observed the effects that we did, the sort of people concocting racism where there was no evidence of it, on the basis of a very minor intervention, that's like reading a single paragraph,
right.
It at least raises the possibility that when people are in a culture or organizational context in which this type of rhetoric is pervasive, that they are constantly being exposed or primed to think about race in these terms. And because of the steady diet of this kind of rhetoric, the effects are likely to be more enduring than anything we could possibly observe.
Right, fair enough. Well, I would also say probably you evaluated some of the weaker systemic effects of that kind of rhetoric, because it isn't merely exposure to the rhetoric, it's the fact that post hoc detection of such things as microaggressions, let's say, are radically rewarded by the participants in those ideological systems.
Absolutely.
That'd be an even more, that's a more powerful effect. So you got it with weak exposure fundamentally. Okay, so
and no reward, right? I mean, you're peeking to the sort of social reward.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I would say, and that's the weakness of your intervention demonstrated the power of the rhetoric. Okay, what did Kendi have to say about this?
He described us as racist pseudoscientists.
Oh yeah. Okay, well that pretty much covers the territory. Did he say why, or was that unnecessary?
That quote,
how are you at wasting money? My sense is that he was particularly good at that. So, university money counterproductively. Yeah.
Well, I think most of his was from actually, what's his name? Jack Dorsey from Twitter. I think gave him $10 million. So at least it wasn't state money, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, well then, we can just let it go. So, okay. You said that produced quite a splash.
Yes.
Including enhanced probability of being on this podcast, for example.
Yes.
So I'd followed your work for a long time before coming across that. So what effect has it had? When was the study published, first of all?
Well,
and is it a sequence? Is it a single study?
No, it's three studies.
Three studies.
So it's essentially the same structure for an anti-Islamophobia intervention and an anti-caste oppression. And it's essentially the same results. There's little minor differences, but it's essentially the same pattern of results. They're not published. So these studies I conducted in collaboration with the NCRI. NCRI is the Network Contagion Research Institute. They are a freestanding research institute that started out mostly doing research along the lines of this sort of large language model stuff that you were talking about earlier, analysis of social media and analysis of radicalism, conspiracy theories, hate, sort of groups and individuals mobilizing online. And they've done it with all sorts of stuff. They've done it with COVID conspiracies. They've done it with QAnon. They've done it with Islamophobia. They've done it with anti-Hindu hate. They've done it with anti-Semitism. They were the first group of any kind, as far as I know, in the summer of 2020, the height of the George Floyd social justice protests, which, as you remember, the rhetoric on the left, this is sort of consistent with what you were talking about earlier, about how the reasonable left is in complete denial of the far left. It is literally true that most of the protests were peaceful. Whenever someone would present evidence of some protests not being peaceful at all, like firebombing a police station or capturing downtown Seattle or all sorts of, setting creating sort of setting the stage for lawlessness. You would have looting and robberies that weren't really part of the protest, but people were taking advantage of the sort of police-free zones and stuff. When you would talk about that, the response was, this is all just right.
Of course.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I talked to moderate Democrats who told me that Antifa was a figment of the right-wing imagination.
Yes, right.
I thought, but there's something weird about that that's very much worth pointing out, I believe, is that we radically underestimate the effect a very small minority of people who are organized can have in destabilizing a society.
That's right.
For example, in the flux of the aftermath of World War I, Russia was chaotic enough so that a very small minority of people, that would be the Bolsheviks, destabilized and captured the entire country. So even if the true radicals on the left are 3%, say, well, 97% of them are peaceful. It's like, fair enough, but you're suffering from the delusion that a demented minority is harmless. And that's,
that's right.
Seriously wrong.
Okay, so enter the NCRI. So in summer of 2020, when this was all the record, most of the protests are peaceful, complete denial, mainstream media that there was violence and bombings and all sorts of other stuff. The NCRI, this is the first project I did with them, produces an analysis finding that the far left groups, not conventional liberals or Democrats, but these far left radical groups were exploiting the earnest commitment to anti-racism or the social justice on the part of people justifiably upset about George Floyd's murder and the implications about that for racism beyond that. But these far left groups were exploiting that to both gin up supporters and to mobilize online. This is all occurring on social media to capture protests, to ratchet up and inspire more aggressive violence at the protests. So this,
that's exactly what you'd expect.
Right,
of course that's going to happen.
Yeah, I know, right.
Clearly.
Yes.
If you believe in criminals.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, and then NCRI would, in this report, would then link the increased online activity. There would be memes like ACAB, all cops are bastards. So there'd be things like that. And some of the groups were actually using social media to coordinate their, the sort of violent protest activities. So live, I'm making this up, but it was this kind of thing. People would be, at these protests on their phones. They would get instructions from some sort of central place that the cops were over here, so everybody needs to go over there. And that's how they would have. So they were getting tactical instructions live via social media, in addition to sort of ginning up the rhetoric to garner support and adherence. Okay, so before they brought me on, maybe 2 or 3 months before, the NCRI had posted a report on how far-right groups do essentially the same thing. You know, sort of mobilize online using memes and catchphrases and, you know, garner adherence, gain adherence and stuff. So they bring me on, we do this thing, and this paper on the far left, which really looked to me like the far left groups were seeking to ignite an actual revolution.
Well, that is what they do.
I know, right? Yes, this doesn't seem far-fetched, right?
They can dance in the ashes that way.
Right, yes.
The real criminal psychopaths, the short-term guys, the narcissists, they thrive in chaos. Because their niche is chaos. Yeah, right?
It was, yes. So I was kind of new to that at the time, but in hindsight, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it's a shocking thing to know.
The NCRI, this to no credit to me, I'm an academic, I'm a professor, I don't do this kind of thing, had access to journalists that at the New York Times and Washington Post who ran stories on this report. And it was the first time there was any acknowledgement in the mainstream media that there was any level of violence and danger in the protests. I felt really good about it. This was like September 2020. We did the work over the summer. The thing came, but that report is not published in a peer-reviewed journal. NCRI has its own website, and they publish these reports, kind of like old time.
And that's where your studies were what?
Yes and no. So as of right now, that's where they are. They're available on the NCRI website.
Okay, and who did that? Was a postdoc, a doctoral student?
It was a bunch of, it was me, two of my grad students, although both of my grad students also work closely with the NCRI. And then there were a series of analysts at the NCRI, including their head researcher.
Okay.
So a bunch of us are co-authors on this. We have this, so I've now been working with them for several years. And it took a while for us to get used to each other. You know, their strength is this online social media, large language model, topic network stuff, you know, with an eye towards threats and conspiracy theories and hate. And my strength is conventional social science surveys.
That's a nice overlap.
It is.
Yeah, it's a nice overlap.
It is. We needed to figure out the best synergies.
No doubt.
It took a while, but we have this rhythm.
So why that approach with regards to the dissemination of this information, this particular experimental information, rather than the more standard journal approach?
Yes. So one of the things, first is let me give context. A little more context. So our rhythm is first we post stuff essentially as a white paper, as a report on the NCRI site. It gets some attention, some public vetting, we get some feedback on it, and then we scale it up for peer review.
Right. Well, that's not unlike doing a pre-release on
like doing
a convention.
Yes, okay. It's a little different. It's different. It is like I have taken to calling it a homespun preprint. And here's why I call it a homespun preprint. It's like a preprint in that it's a report of empirical studies that is posted online that haven't been peer reviewed. It is unlike a conventional preprint in that it is and this is the answer to your question, why did we do it this way rather than wait for peer review? This is part of the answer. It is, even though some of it is highly technical, a lot of the worst of the technical stuff is stripped down so that it is comprehensible to the lay intelligent audience. And that has a value in and of its own right, because the problem with peer review is that it could there are many problems with peer review, especially now.
Many.
You're right, there's many. Okay. But one of them is that it could take a year, 2 years.
Lagged public.
It's horrible.
It's unforgivable.
That's right.
It needs to be, that whole system I've been thinking about.
It needs to be upended.
Completely. It's like, in this day and age, a 2-year lag to publication
it's crazy.
It's completely insane.
It's crazy. That's right.
You spend 30% of your time writing grand applications that go nowhere, and 2 years to lag to publication that almost no one is likely to read.
That's right.
Yeah, not good. How the hell have you not been canceled? Why is that? Because it's weird.
There have been repeat attempts to cancel me that have failed.
Okay. Well, so why don't you tell me and everybody else, first of all, why you're what would you say? Why you so richly deserve canceling. That's the first issue. And then the next issue, which is of equal importance, is how you've managed to not have that happen, because that's actually really hard. So, because if people try to cancel you, especially given the things that you've researched and have insisted upon and said, if people try to cancel you, there's an overwhelming probability in academia in particular that will be successful. So let's start by talking about the sorts of things that you've been pointing to in academia in general, and then more specifically in psychology and social psychology.
Sure. There are probably too many of these attempts for me to go through, so I'm going to pick one.
Yeah, pick the cream of the crop.
Yeah, this is probably the cream of the crop.
Okay.
It is, I refer to, so I have a very active Substack site, Unsafe Science, and I have several posts on this. You can find it under the Pops Fiasco Racist Mule Trope. There's a whole series on this. Okay, so what is Pops? Pops is Perspectives on Psych Science, one of the very prestigious journals within the field of psychology for publishing reviews and commentaries and the like. The short version is that I was invited by the editor to do a commentary on a main paper that was critical. The main paper by a psychologist named Bernard Hummel, was critical of prior work in psychology advocating for diversity in a variety of ways. The nature of his critique was that much of the rhetoric in psychological scholarship around diversity was narrowly focused on, and the terms are constantly changing, underrepresented, minoritized, disadvantaged, oppressed groups. And that from a scientific
intersectionally.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so
intersectionally deprived.
And there was a recent article which argued that on scientific grounds, we need to do exactly that. Hummel's critique was really multiple, but two of his key points were that, well, there are some types of things it's irrelevant. Diversity is irrelevant for certain kind of theoretical scientific tests.
Yep.
And then the other point is that if diversity matters, it matters for scientific purposes. It matters extremely broadly, and it's not restricted to underrepresented groups. And a very simple example would be if you would compare a study based on undergraduate psychology students versus one based on a nationally representative sample. The research based on the nationally representative sample is going to be broader and more generalizable and more credible. A nationally representative sample represents the population. It's not focused entirely on any subset of the population. That would be a very simple example of Hummel's point. I was asked to do a commentary. I did.
And there's a distinction there too that we should draw. Clearly, it's the case that if you want to draw generalizable conclusions about human beings from a study, that the study participants should be a randomly selected and representative sample of the population to whom you're attempting to generalize, obviously, because otherwise it doesn't generalize. That's very different than making the case that underrepresented groups should be preferentially hired or employed or promoted or
completely different. Completely different. That was sort of part of Hummel's critique.
Yeah.
But I guess so. Again, the editor invited me to publish a commentary on this exchange, and the title of my commentary it eventually got published, is "Diversity is Diverse." Because there's lots of different kinds of diversity. And if we're arguing for diversity on scientific grounds, then what the science needs to be is fully representative of whether it's the participants or the topics, or it goes way beyond oppression. I mean, oppression is a part of that and shouldn't be excluded, but it's only one piece of that. So I basically was in agreement with Hummel's critique and augmented it. As part of that, I critiqued progressive academic rhetoric around diversity as disingenuous and hypocritical. And the way I framed that, the way I captured it, was using a quote from Fiddler on the Roof. So in Fiddler on the Roof, which is what early 20th century Jewish life in the
one of the great movies of all time. Everyone,
right,
everyone should watch it.
And probably its most famous song is Tradition, which is about the importance of tradition and keeping the community together. But then there were exceptions. So there's an interlude in the song Tradition where the villagers get into an argument because one chimes in, there was the time he sold him a horse but delivered a mule. And I use that to frame my discussion of progressive disingenuousness.
They all disintegrate into fractious argument in the middle of this song about unity too, don't they, when that comes up.
When that comes up, that's right. That's right. And I argued in this paper that the way in which, the reason that's a good metaphor for progressive rhetoric around diversity is that diversity superficially it sounds good to a lot of people, right? Because who doesn't want to be included? No matter what group you're a member of, the idea that someone is advocating for diversity, it's kind of appealing. And for example,
yes, with 2 seconds of thought, it's a positive thing.
Yes, with 2 seconds of thought, it's a positive thing.
Or that people should be free of arbitrary exclusion.
Yeah, of arbitrary exclusion.
Yes,
that's right.
yes.
That's right. And for example, one thing one might think if one had a little bit of knowledge is that, especially in the social sciences and humanities, but really in academia writ large, there's hardly anyone who is not left of center. I mean, the range goes from sort of center left to the far, far left. I have a former...
Yes, and that's very well documented.
It's very...
No one disagrees with that claim.
Well, so Nate Honeycutt, my former student, he's now a research scientist at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, did a dissertation on this. He surveyed almost 2,000 faculty nationwide at the top colleges and universities and found that 40% self-identified, not just as on the left, the amount on the left was about 90-95%, but 40% self-identified as radicals, activists, Marxists, or socialists.
Yeah.
40%. So this is the extreme left. This is no longer just like Democrats or liberals. This is nearly half on the far left.
And that was a sample of how many people?
It was almost 2,000, yeah.
When we think about wildly successful businesses, we often focus on their great products, cool branding, and brilliant marketing. But there's an unsung hero in their success stories, the business behind the business that makes selling simple. For millions of entrepreneurs, that business is Shopify. Shopify is home to the #1 checkout on the planet. And here's the not-so-secret secret. With Shop Pay, they boost conversions up to 50%. That means fewer abandoned carts and more completed sales. Our marketing team uses Shopify every day to sell our merchandise, and we love how easy it is to add more items, ship products, and track conversions. In today's market, growth-minded businesses need a commerce solution that's just as flexible and dynamic as they are. Whether your customers are browsing your website, scrolling through social media, or wandering into your store, Shopify ensures you're ready to sell. Ready to elevate your business? Upgrade your business today and get the same checkout Daily Wire uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/JBP, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/JBP today to upgrade your selling. That's shopify.com/JBP.
Now, how many faculty members at colleges and universities do you suppose there are in the United States approximately? Do you have any idea?
I have looked into this. It's hundreds of thousands. I don't know the number.
Okay, so
I don't remember. I have looked into it. It's very large.
200,000.
Yep.
So that means there's 80,000 academic activists who are being employed full-time in the United States.
I don't know if you could go that far because he looked at the top colleges and universities. If you wanted to generalize to all colleges and universities, you would have to include community colleges and, primarily liberal arts.
Do you think they'd be less?
I don't know.
Biased? Okay, we don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, so it's not 80,000, but It could easily be 50,000.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a number I want to return to. Okay. Yeah,
Okay,
because
so-
there's implications.
So one might think if someone is advocating for diversity, given the extreme political skew and given the extent to which academia deals with politicized topics, that there would be an embrace of people, an attempt to bring into academia professors, researchers, scholars, teachers from across the political spectrum. That has never gotten any traction in academia. And in fact, it's gone in the complete opposite direction. If you go back 50, 60 years, I think it's fair to describe the way academia has functioned is to produce a slow-moving purge of conservatives and even people center and libertarians from its ranks. So my point in this commentary was using things like that as examples of the disingenuousness of progressive rhetoric around diversity, that it wasn't really diversity in the broadest sense. It was a very, very narrow...
See, that's actually the fundamental flaw of intersectionality, is intersectionality devolves into combinatorial explosion almost immediately, right? Because once you start combining the categories of oppression, you don't have to make... your list of combinations, black, women, gay, etc. Every time you add another variable to that multiplicative list, you decrease the pool of people that occupy that list radically, right? But there's also there's literally an indefinite, this is your point, an indefinite number of potentially relevant group categories.
Yes.
Right? So how in the world are you going to ensure that every possible combination of every possible group category is... You can't even measure it, much less ensure it.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Right, so there's this underlying insistence, which you're pointing to, I believe, that there are privileged categories of oppressed people, right? And it's a weird thing, right? It's like, why is it that it's race and sex? And you might think, well, those are the most obvious differences between people, and maybe you can make that case. But then it's also gender, which is a very weird insistence, because whether the idea of gender is a valid, I don't think the idea of gender is a valid idea at all. I think it's what would you say? It's a warped misconceptualization of everything that's captured by temperament much more accurately and precisely. We could talk about that, but also sexual orientation. I can't see at all why that would emerge as a privileged category of oppression alongside something like sex. Like it could, but it's not obvious why. Okay, so you're pointing some of, and then you said, well, there's important elements of diversity, especially intellectually.
That's right.
Like adequate distribution of political or ethical views across the spectrum that's completely off the table.
Yeah, it's completely off the table. It's like rejected. It's worse than off the table. So that was my paper. There's more to the story than this, but to keep this succinct, eventually what happened was almost 1,400 academics, probably mostly psychologists, signed an open letter denouncing. So my paper was one of several commentaries. All of the commentaries were critical of this oppression framing of diversity.
All of them?
All of them.
Okay. And this was in POPS?
It was in, Perspectives on Psych Science.
Okay, so I just want to provide people some background on this, and correct me if I get any of this wrong. So scientists publish in research journals, and they generally publish articles of two types. One type would be a research study, an actual experiment, let's say, or a sequence of experiments. And the other, I guess there's two other types. There's reviews and there's commentaries. And then there's a variety of different journals that scientists publish in, and some of those cover all scientific topics. Science and Nature, the world's premier scientific journals, used to do that before they became woke institutions. And then there are specialized journals that cover fields like psychology, and then there are subspecialized journals. And the less specialized the journal, all things considered, the more prestigious it is. Anyways, that's where scientists publish. And They do publish commentaries on each other's material, especially if it's a review of something contentious or something that's emerging in the field. And now this journal, Perspectives on Psychological Science, there's also an interesting backstory here because that's an American Psychological Society journal.
Yes.
Okay, so there's two major organizations for psychologists especially research-oriented psychologists in North America. There's the American Psychological Association, which has its journals, and then a newer organization, which is now a couple of decades old, American Psychological Society. And the American Psychological Society was actually set up, at least in part, because the American Psychological Association had started to become ideologically dominated, particularly in the leftist and progressive direction, and that was having a arguably negative effect on research, reliability, accuracy, and probability of publication. That was set up 25.
Okay, so that's a little off kilter.
Okay.
Yes, I do know this history.
Okay.
First place, APS started out as the American Psychological Society. They changed their name to the Association for Psychological Science. In an attempt to be broader. And what triggered the breakaway of APS from APA in the 90s, maybe?
90s, I think so. Yeah.
Wasn't political. It was the scientists who formed APS believed that APA was too focused on clinical practice and practitioner issues.
Right.
And it was becoming unscientific, but not because of the politics.
Well, okay, so fair enough. But see, I was watching that happen because I knew some of the people who were setting up the APS at the time. And my sense, though, also was that part of the reason that the APA was tilting in a more and more clinical direction was because there was an underlying political ethos that was increasingly skeptical of science as the privileged mode of obtaining valid information.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Okay.
Yes.
So the proximal cause was the overemphasis on the clinical.
Yes.
But, it's also the case that, as you've seen, is that certainly the clinical psychology and the whole therapeutic enterprise has taken a cataclysmic turn towards the woke direction especially in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
It's been absolutely devastating. And I don't know, is social psychology, I think you could probably say the same thing about social psychology. Maybe you could say maybe that's even worse. Anyways, we can get into that.
It's probably worse politically, but it's probably not worse practically because social psychologists aren't responsible for helping anybody get on with their lives. I mean, they're responsible for teaching and students and things. They're not
responsible for implicit bias.
That's all we can. You are going to get me distracted. You started by asking me to tell the story of my cancellation.
Let's continue with that. Okay, so now there's 1,400 people who write a letter.
Yes, declaring all of us, me as well as the other commentators, we're all racists.
Yeah.
The editor should be fired, and our articles should be taken down. They should.
Right. So I presume that these 1,400 are a subset of the 50,000 activists.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, I'm curious about the 1,400 too, because you often see legacy media headline news that 1,400 scientists have signed some petition or other. But then when you look into it, it's often, I know the distinction between graduate student and let's say full-fledged scientist is
fuzzy,
murky.
Yeah.
But part of the issue is always, exactly who were these 1,400 people, right? And out from under which rocks did they climb? And so who were the 1,400? Like, roughly speaking, who were these people that signed
it was 1,400. I mean, I didn't recognize many of the names. But if you assume the first 5 or 10 names are the likely organizers, those were all well-established psychologists, especially social psychologists.
Yes.
Yeah, they were social psychologists.
So you got a backlash from...
A huge backlash. And part of the accusation, for me in particular, was that by using this line from Fiddler on the Roof, there was the time he sold him a horse but delivered a mule, as a frame for progressive disingenuousness around diversity, I was comparing black people to mules.
Oh yeah, I see.
And so that drove...
That was your subtext, wasn't it?
I was explicit in part of the denunciation.
Right.
And so it was an immediate firestorm.
This was when? What year did this happen?
2022.
Oh yeah,
2022.
Okay, so this is very new.
There is actually part of this backstory is very interesting. The editor of the journal at the time is a European psychologist named Klaus Fiedler. Klaus Fiedler is very accomplished. He's an unbelievably honors, hundreds of journal articles, multiple editorships and awards. He was the editor overseeing all this. And my and the other commentaries that he eventually accepted started out as simple reviews. So when Hamel submitted his paper, it was subjected to peer review. I was one of the peer reviewers. So was one of the other. Fiedler so liked the reviews that he asked all of us to scale them up to full-length articles.
Are you tired of feeling sluggish, run down, or just not your best self? Take control of your health and vitality today with Balance of Nature. With Balance of Nature, there's never been a more convenient dietary supplement to ensure you get a wide variety of fruits and vegetables every day. Balance of Nature takes fruits and vegetables, they freeze dry them, turn them into a powder, and then they put them into a capsule. The capsules are completely void of additives, fillers, extracts, synthetics, pesticides, or added sugar. The only thing in Balance of Nature fruit and veggie capsules are fruits and veggies. Right now, you can order with promo code Jordan to get 35% off your first order, plus get a free bottle of fiber and spice. Experience Balance of Nature for yourself today. Go to balanceofnature.com and use promo code Jordan for 35% off your first order as a preferred customer, plus get a free bottle of fiber and spice. That's balanceofnature.com, promo code Jordan for 35% off your first preferred order, plus a free bottle of fiber and spice.
Scientists publish their research findings and their reviews of the literature in scientific journals. And it's one of the ways that the quality of these articles is vetted is by submitting the manuscripts before they're published to, well, first of all, the editor reviews them to see if they're even vaguely possibly suitable for publication in that particular journal on the basis of, let's say, topic and quality and apparent integrity of research. Then they're sent out to experts in that area, multiple experts, for analysis. And that's part of the quality control process. And that worked pretty well up until about 2015, I would say, or maybe even spectacularly well, all things considered. So that's the peer review process. And what happened in this case was the peer reviews of this particular article were of sufficient quality so that the editor decided that they might
them as commentary.
Right. They might turn into standalone pieces with some development.
But I warned Fiedler, the editor, in my review, before anyone had the idea that a version of my review would get published, that if he accepted Hamel's critique of the way in which psychologists write and think about diversity, what they've been advocating with respect to diversity, that he would be at heightened risk of people coming after him, demanding the papers be retracted, and coming after his job. This is in my review. Mm. And Jordan, that is exactly.
Was that included when it was published, or was that?
I don't remember. I'd have to go by. I think I may have taken it out because it wasn't really appropriate because the commentary wasn't. It was about the exchange. It wasn't a message to the editor.
No, fine.
So,
I mean, it's not
I don't think it's in
necessarily the case that it would stick.
Yeah. So Firestorm, APS, the executive director committee of APS, whatever that group is of committee, put an immediate kibosh on this. It was going to be all published as a discussion forum. That's how Fiedler framed it, as a discussion forum about diversity issues. They put immediate halt.
Okay, who's they?
It's again the officers of the American of the Association for Psychological Science.
Okay, so now they're broadly overseeing the group of journals that publish under their aegis.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, but they generally don't have an editorial say.
No, they don't,
and shouldn't.
Right? But the editor is to some extent beholden. I mean, that's who he's working for. So.
But it's still the case that generally they don't do
they don't do this, right.
Partly because often, they don't have the specialized expertise, at least in part, which is partly why they hire the editors to begin with, who then they give pretty much carte blanche.
Yes.
Right, as they should, because that's part of academic freedom.
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, but they decided that they were not going to proceed with the publication.
Well,
or
so the open letter had two main demands. They weren't even required, they were demands. That Fiedler be fired and the papers be retracted.
Okay.
They conducted what looked to me, and really to all of us involved, like a kangaroo court, into what happened. They concluded that Fiedler had somehow violated editorial ethics and norms,
which is a serious accusation.
Yes.
Like a career-ending accusation, if it's true.
Yes. Well, he's had a very nice career since, so it did not succeed.
That's good, but that doesn't detract from the seriousness of the allegation.
Yes.
The fact that he was able to successfully wend his way through the thicket.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So he was ousted almost immediately. And then the papers, mine included, that were part of Fiedler's discussion forum.
And that had been published.
They had been accepted but not published.
I see. Okay. That was the missing
but
piece.
not published. That's
so
right.
how the hell did the complainants get access to the papers? Like, how did they know what the papers were if they hadn't been published?
Someone must have, maybe through the editorial process is largely online, so I'm sure they could have accessed the papers through the online editorial process. I'm sure they could have asked Fiedler for the papers. Had they asked us for the papers,
well, they weren't secret. They weren't secret.
Yeah, they weren't secret.
I mean, people want, they're publishing their papers so that people will read them. I was just curious because it's strange that a brouhaha of that sort would emerge prior to publication, but there was quasi-publication.
Yeah, well, it was right, exactly. It was accepted, but not published.
Got it.
So they ousted him almost immediately, and then the papers, they brought in two special editors to figure out what to do with the papers accepted as part of the discussion forum, and
who were these special editors, and what made them special?
Well, there was Samin Vazir and E.J. Wagenmakers. And both of them, I think Samin is now the head editor at Psychological Science. Mm-hmm. So they both have had long careers advocating with some success for upgrading the quality and credibility and rigor of psychological science. They both have made important contributions that way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why they were brought in. They had a certain cachet as able to figure out what to do. I think that's what the APS directory believed.
On what grounds do you think this investigation was justified? How was the progression of this investigation justified? I mean, there's no established precedent in the scientific community for re-evaluating an editorial decision based on political objection, right? Like, there's no, we'll re-evaluate if 500 people sign a petition. Like, this isn't the domain of rule or principle or tradition, right? It's what's the fear here, do you think? These 1,400 people signed this petition, which is something that takes like 2 seconds and costs you nothing and has no risk to you whatsoever. And so it's not an ethical statement of any profundity unless you're an activist. So what was it, do you think, that raised people's hackles about the mere fact that these complaints had been raised?
To this second, I don't really know. Like, from their perspective.
Are you willing to speculate?
Well, so sure. The main object of Hummel's critique was a black or biracial social psychologist at Stanford, Stephen Roberts, and Roberts denounced the whole process as racist. Publicly.
Okay.
Publicly. And I do think that...
On what grounds? The mere fact of questioning the diversity agenda.
Well, that would, I would
constitutes
say
racism.
He probably had 3 main grounds.
Yeah.
That was one of them. Absolutely. You criticize this. This shows
that you're
racist. The racism and that is pervasive throughout psychology.
Right.
That would be one grounds. Second ground was my use of this, comparing blacks to mules. With there was the time he sold him a horse and delivered a mule. And then the third was there was a considerable. So Fiedler
kind of
offered
missing the point of that.
I know. Yeah, right. Fiedler offered Roberts the opportunity to respond to the full set of papers, which were generally supporting Hammel's critique, which was really about diversity in general, but its jumping off point was a prior paper by Roberts.
Okay.
But he gave Roberts a chance to reply to the critiques. But there was a considerable back and forth between Roberts and Fiedler about whether, when, and how to publish Roberts' response.
Okay.
Fiedler was probably kind of a pain in the ass. But in my experience, editors, I don't know how many times, I don't have enough fingers and toes to count the number of times I have subjectively experienced editors' comments as pains in the ass. But
at least once per paper submitted.
Yeah, right? But whatever. But those were his grounds for denouncing all of us as racist. Fiedler made his life difficult. This whole critique of diversity is a testament to white supremacy pervasive in psychology, and me comparing black people to mules.
Yeah, got it.
Right, that was the grounds. And you asked me to speculate. I have at best very circumstantial evidence. I may not even have circumstantial evidence. I strongly suspect, I would really like to test this in the lab or in surveys, that liberals, especially white liberals, are so racked with guilt and shame over the bona fide history of white supremacy and discrimination and oppression in the United States, in Europe, and especially in the UK, it's more about colonialism, right? Are so racked with guilt that there is a vulnerability to just believing anything a person from one of these oppressed, stigmatized groups says, denouncing others.
Yeah, well,
as
it's
that
a
kind of
very
this.
quick and easy way to signify the fact that you're not part of the oppressor camp.
That's
yes,
right.
Well, has that not been formally tested as a hypothesis?
If it has, I don't know. I
it
don't
needs
know.
to be.
Yes, I agree. It totally needs to be.
It's something like, from more broadly speaking, is that it's a mechanism of gaming the reputation domain, right? Because obviously our reputations are probably, arguably, the most valuable commodity, so to speak, that we possess. And every system of value is susceptible to gaming in a variety of ways. And one way of gaming the reputational game is to make claims of reputational virtue that are risk-free, broad, immediate, and cost-free. Right. And for me, if you're accused of something, and I can say, and accused of transgressing against a group towards whom I feel guilt, I can signify my valor as a moral agent by also denouncing you. And it costs me nothing. Right. Which is a big problem. Right. It's like, maybe it's the problem of our time. It's a very big problem.
It's a huge problem.
Well, especially now, because there's something else that's happened, right? Is that groups of denunciators can get together with much greater ease than they ever could.
Yes, because of social media.
And the effort necessary to make a denunciation has plummeted to zero. Right. And the consequences of making a false denunciation are also zero.
Yes,
right.
Zero.
So this is not good.
Yes.
It's like denunciation firestorm time. And that's certainly happening.
Well, so, I mostly agree. Certainly in the short term, the personal consequences of engaging in this sort of denunciation behavior are non-existent. But the consequences are not non-existent. So the credibility and trust and faith in academia has been in decline for a very long time. People hate this kind of stuff. So there was,
yeah, well, just because something's advantageous for some people in the short run does not mean that it's good for the whole game in the medium to long run.
Right.
That's for sure.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly.
Well, that's actually, I think, in some ways, the definition of an impulsive moral error. Like, if it accrues benefit to you in the short run, but does you in the medium run, that's not a very wise strategy.
Yes.
Right. And that's what impulsive people do all the time. So
yes,
right. That's even the definition of what constitutes a temptation.
I was recently listening to your interview for this podcast with Keith Campbell on narcissism.
Yes,
and that was one of the things you talked about, this sort of impulse control and short-term benefits versus long-term benefits, especially regarding social relations, right?
Yeah.
And
reputation's a long-term game.
It's a long-term game. And there has been emerging evidence that people high in left-wing authoritarianism, sort of extreme...
Now that we all agree that exists, which only started in 2016.
I know. Yeah. That's a whole backstory.
That's for sure.
So, but is correlated with narcissism. And that this pleasure that people on this sort of cancel culture that has emerged, I mean, the right is not immune to cancel culture type activities, but it emerged primarily originally on the left.
Any place infiltrated by narcissists is going to be susceptible to exactly. And the narcissists will use whatever political stance gains them the most immediate credibility.
That's right.
Completely independent of the validity of the ideological stance.
Yeah.
See, one of the things we'll get back to the story right away. Yeah. See, one of the things I've observed, this is very interesting, because I've talked to a lot of moderate progressives, let's say, or moderate, or actually even genuine liberals within the Democrat. Congressmen and senators, many of them. And I've been struck by one thing, and I'm curious about what you think about this. We know that a tilt towards empathy, so agreeableness, trait agreeableness, a tilts you in a liberal direction and maybe in a progressive direction. And there are concomitants of being more agreeable on the personality side. But I think one of them is that the moderates that I've talked to always denied the existence of the pathological radicals on the left. And I've really thought, this is to a man or a woman. It's, And I think what it is, I think it has something to do with the unwillingness or inability of the more liberal types to have imagination for evil. Like, I would make the case that most criminals, you could validly interpret most criminals whose criminal history is sporadic and short as victims. They've come from abusive families, alcoholic families, often multi-generationally antisocial families, etc. But there's a subset of criminals. It's 1% of the criminals, 65% of the crimes. There's a subset of criminals who are not victims. They are really monsters. And I don't think there's any imagination for the monstrous among the compassionate left. It's all victims. It doesn't matter how egregious the crime. Now, that's something I would have tested as a social psychologist if I still had an active research lab, which I don't. But the problem with what we know from simulations that networks of cooperators can establish themselves in a way that's mutually beneficial and productive. But that if a shark is dropped into a tank of cooperators, then the shark takes everything. So the problem with being agreeable and cooperative is that the monsters can get you. And if you're temperamentally tilted towards denying the existence of the monster, so much the worse. Now, I made that case because you talked about the relationship between narcissism and left-wing authoritarianism. I mean, that narcissism shades into sadism as well. And so this is a very big problem, especially with online denunciation. Okay, so back to 2022. Now there's debate about whether these papers are going to proceed to publication.
Right,
and there's allegations made against the people who wrote the reviews.
Absolutely. We're all racist, and the whole thing was racist, and an abuse of editorial power, and it's all these accusations.
Right, and the editor loses his position.
He loses his position, and these two special editors are brought in.
Okay.
Negotiations go on for almost 2 years. Like, what are they negotiating about? Who's gonna? So part of Robert's denunciation, public denunciation of all of us, was he posted the draft of his commentary response that was headed for the discussion forum and the full set of emails he exchanged with Fiedler about publishing it. And those are, those are typically confidential communications between an editor and an author. And so,
or at least typically private.
Yes, right. They're typically private. So that added to the difficulty on the part of the special editors to decide what to do, because they didn't want to just publish those. Roberts didn't agree not to at first. Fiedler, they wanted Fiedler's permission to publish the correspondence. He wouldn't grant it.
So why did Smith have such an outsized say in all this? Like, that isn't how the scientific process generally works.
So once APS blew up the journal by firing Fiedler. So there was
which is like an admission of fault.
So, and about 2/3 of the editorial board resigned when he was ousted. So Pops
that was protest
without
resignation.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was protest. We know they resigned, whether it was protest or not. So they were.
Maybe they also thought it was trouble they didn't need.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yes,
I mean, these are generally, when you're working for a scientific journal, you're not doing it for the money, right? It's a lot of work. And the editors, was he paid? Was that his full-time job?
It was not his full-time job, and I don't know whether he was paid.
Right. Okay, so that just illustrates the point, is that people are doing this because that's actually what you do as a scientist. There's not a lot of, it's a prestigious position and you meet people. You have a certain say over the direction the field might go. And those are perks, but generally people do this like they do peer review because it's part of the tradition of scientific activity.
Right.
And so
that's right.
So you can see why people might bail out if it was going to just be nothing but reputation and catastrophe.
Exactly.
Because they'd be thinking, why the hell am I going to expose myself to like this dismal risk when there's it's already hard and there's very little upside.
Right, exactly. Right, okay. So the journal was a mess for a long time. And these editors, and there was this exchange between the editors, Roberts, Fiedler, and the other contributors, myself and the other contributors, about whether and when to publish it. And again, this went on for almost 2 years. So there was first a discussion, we're going to publish it. Then there was radio silence. Well, it turns out we've run into an obstacle. Can we resolve? And it just went on for almost 2 years. Eventually that was resolved and it was all published. It's all published. And, your original question was framed as, you can't believe I haven't been subject to a cancellation attack. I have. You then asked, well, how did you survive it? Let me add this little punchline.
Yeah.
At the time that all this was happening, my immediate associate dean, so I was chair of the psychology department at Rutgers, and Rutgers is in the School of Arts and Sciences. The School of Arts and Sciences has a dean. But the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers is gigantic. Even as chair, I had very little direct contact with the dean. The dean was doing big deanly things. But the department chairs have a lot of contact with an associate chair. So there might be an associate chair for the sciences.
Associate dean?
Associate dean, associate dean, associate dean. So there'd be an associate dean for math, for STEM, associate dean for social science, and associate dean for humanities. I had a lot to do with the associate dean for social sciences, who was a psychologist from the psychology department. Okay, so I never actually had this conversation exactly with him, but I'm pretty sure he knew about the whole thing. So at the end of my term, so this is now 2023, I go on sabbatical. Remember that this event occurred, the POPs event occurred in 2022. It's not till almost 2 years later that the stuff was published. So I complete my term as department chair 2022, 2022-23, I go on sabbatical, still not published. And then at the end of that sabbatical term, the associate dean approaches me with an offer to chair the anthropology department. Okay, so this is very weird.
Yeah, definitely.
It's very weird. There was an internal political snafu, which is beyond the scope of this discussion, and they couldn't appoint an internal chair, and they wanted an external, the department needed a chair. The dean's office had a lot of faith and confidence in my ability. Because of it. One of the things they said to me was, this is going to be a difficult situation because the department is not going to be happy about having an outside chair imposed on them, but we know you have a thick skin.
Wow.
And I parlayed that into a very large raise. Jordan, it was one of the best things I've ever done. So not only did I escape cancellation, I parlayed it into an improvement in the quality of
this is a good thing for people to know too. You know, if you've watched my podcast, because I say this all the time, that mythologically speaking, that every treasure has a dragon, right? And that's a representation of the world because the world is full of threat and opportunity. And the co-association of the dragon and the treasure is a mythological trope indicating that there's opportunity where there's peril. But there's a corollary to that, which is a very interesting one, which is where there's peril, there's opportunity. And so you might think when something negative happens to you, let's say on the social side, that you become the brunt of a cancellation attempt, you might think, oh my God, my life's over. It's like, yeah, that's one possible outcome. That's the same outcome as, ending up as dragon toast, let's say. But the other outcome is that you find the treasure that's associated with the dragon, and that can definitely happen. And that's a good thing to know because it means that when things become shaky around you, one of the things you can validly ask yourself is, there's something positive lurking here if I had the wisdom to see it and the capacity for transformation necessary to allow the challenge to change me. Yeah, that's right.
Jordan, I wouldn't wish that at the time that it was happening.
Right.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
I wouldn't wish it on anyone. In hindsight, it has made me a better person. And I wouldn't undo it now if I could.
Yeah. Well, you know what Nietzsche said? If it doesn't kill you,
yes,
it makes you stronger.
Here.
Now, unfortunately, there's an if. Well, seriously, right?
No, yes,
so,
absolutely.
And the if is that the dragon is real. It's not a game.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, no, FIRE, the same outfit, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, keeps a faculty under FIRE database of faculty who have been subject usually to mob, sometimes administrative investigations, seeking to punish them for what should have been legitimate academic speech protected by academic freedom or even free speech. At U.S. state colleges, they're subject to the First Amendment, which means they shouldn't be in the business.
However, hypothetically.
Well, yeah. But they have documented that hundreds of faculty have been fired for what should have been legitimately protected speech. Yeah. So your point about
get rid of the whole conservatives,
so
or liberals.
Your metaphor about the dragon is dead on. That there's no guarantee. People have lost their livelihoods running into these dragons. So that's not.
Yeah. Well, the other thing. So there's some concrete recommendations that can be brought out of that too. I would say, like, if you find yourself in serious trouble, this is one of the things I learned from dealing with very dangerous people in my clinical practice, let's say, dangerous and unstable people. It's a very bad idea to lie when you're in trouble. It's a seriously bad idea. And so if the mob or the monster comes for you, your best defense is extremely cautious, plain truth. Now, that's very different than trying to, strategize and manipulate your way out of a difficult situation. It's also very different than apologizing. And my experience on the woke mob cancellation side is if you lie in your own defense or falsify your speech, you're in serious trouble. Yeah. And if you apologize, a different mob will just come for you. That'll be the post-apology mob that comes for you. It's not a good idea. So, what we've been outlining here is the fact that if you're in serious social peril, there's two outcomes. One is that, perversely enough, in retrospect, it might turn out to be an opportunity and one you wouldn't forego now that you know the consequences. that's not impossible, but it's difficult. The other one is you're seriously done. And so then the question is, what can you do to maximize the possibility of the former and minimize the latter? And those are some things that I know. So, okay, so let's back up a bit then. We still haven't exactly described why the cancellation attempts weren't successful for you.
Yeah.
Now, you said you demonstrated your ability to keep a calm head under fire, and that you did that well enough so the university actually recognized that, and that turned out to be of substantive benefit to you. But we don't know why it was that you maintained a calm head under fire, or how you did that without, well, having the reputation damage that was certainly directly implied by the accusation take you out. Like, was it good fortune? Were there things you did right? Like, how do you assess that?
Yeah. So that was not my first, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was not my first go around with this kind of thing. It helps to have some experience. It helps to have done some reading. The people have addressed, there's some good articles and essays out there about what to do when you're subject to these attacks. Some of them have make very good points. And so about 6 months ago, I posted an essay on my Substack.
What's the name of your Substack?
Unsafe Science.
Unsafe Science.
It's called My Vita of Denunciation.
Okay.
And it's called My Vita of Denunciation because it goes through several of these sorts of attacks that I have been through, and how, first place, it also goes through the tactics. It's a short version. I have a longer version in a different place, but it goes through a short version of how to deal with these attacks. So the very first piece is that if you find yourself in the midst of such an attack, go silent. Go silent. Do not engage. Do not engage with your attackers, because nearly all of these cancellation type attacks are massive, brutal, and short.
Right. And 2 weeks.
Yeah, and most.
That's right.
Yeah.
Most. And people forget. That's the weird thing, because the present is so large.
Yes.
You're going to panic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
don't panic.
Don't panic.
That's right. Don't panic. Don't assume that it's going to be successful.
That's right.
Yeah. Because people, they might be interested in you today, but they weren't interested in you yesterday.
Right.
They probably won't be interested in you tomorrow.
And it's like a jump. As a kid, we used to go to the beach and body surf, and occasionally, like a wave that was way bigger than you could handle would. And there was nothing you could do except let it wash over you and knock you around. And you come out and it washes you on shore.
As long as you don't do anything to make it worse.
Yeah.
Like apologize, for example.
Well, I would add this. If you genuinely, in your heart of heart, believe you have done something wrong, then maybe you should apologize.
Yeah,
but you should not apologize.
Let me add something to that.
Yeah.
No, not if you genuinely believe it, because you might not be your own best defender. That's why you have a Fifth Amendment. Seriously.
Yeah.
Conscientious, guilt-prone people will accuse themselves. So then I would say, if you feel that you've done something wrong, remember the presumption of innocence before provable guilt. Remember that. It applies to you too. And then go talk to 5 or 6 people that you trust and lay out the argument on both sides and see if they think you're the bad guy. Right.
Because, that's good. I agree with that.
You need that.
Yes,
you need
that's
that.
good.
Yeah.
I'm completely on board with that.
Don't assume that you're morally obligated to apologize.
That's right.
Even if you feel guilty.
That's right.
Because your guilt feelings are not an unerring indication of your guilt.
That's right. And may distort how you think about your culpability.
Yes, definitely.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a very good point.
This is why I think too the cancel mob is particularly effective against genuine conservatives, because genuine conservatives tilt towards higher conscientiousness, and it's very easy to make conscientious people feel guilty. Yeah. Right. So that can be weaponized. Yeah. Okay,
all right. So
go silent.
Go silent.
Including, you can always apologize in a month after you've thought it through.
Absolutely.
If anyone still cares.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, go silent.
Go silent.
Yeah.
Record everything.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And
everything.
Everything. You don't know how you're going to use it. You may use it to defend yourself going forward, depending on how things unfold. You may decide after the wave of the attack passes that you want to counterattack.
Yeah, right.
You want some
carefully
level,
and strategically.
Carefully and strategically. And by recording everything, you have the raw material to damn your attackers. So that's it, right? So you go silent.
That's especially true if someone's interviewing you. Yeah, it's like record all of it.
Record all of it. Yeah, record all of it. Seek allies.
Yeah.
Because you may feel alone.
Yeah.
Mobs are very good at coming after somebody who seems alone. But if you have networks, support networks, activate those networks. If you don't have them, and if you're in the intellectual type of professions, whether it's academia or mainstream media, could be in something else, you probably have a support network. Let them know what's going on. My experience has been, at least the kind of networks that I have, people will stand up for you. I had numbers of people writing essays that got posted in some pretty good places. Real Clear Politics, I think, was one, right? On this Pops fiasco. So actually, of all places, the Chronicle of Higher Ed did some great reporting on it. And it really kind of damned the mob. And
that's also why you need that time of silence, is to muster your resources. Right.
Yes.
And you could also assume, even if people are nervous in the aftermath of the accusations for 2 or 3 days or a week even, they may come to their senses as the temperature drops.
Yes, that's right. So, that's absolutely right. And then, so go silent, record everything, activate your support networks.
Yeah.
And then again, it depends on the situation. It's going to vary from person to person and situation to situation. It depends in part on what your skills and resources are. But then you are ready to either defend yourself and or counterattack.
Okay.
And I don't know how many essays I posted on unsafe science surrounding this event. One of them is titled, "There is no racist mule trope." So the argument, the grounds for denouncing me as a racist for comparing black people to mules was that there was a historical trope of making an equivalence between black people and mules. This Roberts presented this, and he had one reference to support this, which I was not familiar with.
Yeah.
So I tracked it down.
That's what you say.
I know. Let's see what the article actually says.
Yeah.
This article was a really good article. And what it documented was that there was a historical linkage between black people and mules because originally American blacks were overwhelmingly in the American South, in the agrarian South. And so the mule was a symbol of both the kind of work that was done in the South, this agricultural work, and it was a symbol of the flawed liberation of black people from slavery, because one of the promises that they never delivered on was 40 acres and a mule. And even though that was never delivered on for a very long time, until you had the mass migration into the North, the black people living in the American South, aspired to be successful farmers, and getting a mule was one way to have a successful farm. And so you would see images, paintings, even, if you go to Southern museums, there's some very famous paintings of black people in fields with a mule pulling a wagon or a I don't know, a cultivator, like a plow, or yes, right. That's very, very common. And in fact, the mule figures fairly largely in African-American folk stories from the American South. So he documents all this.
Yeah.
So much so that the mule really became a symbol of people who were oppressed and part of the liberation of people who were oppressed. So that when, after Martin Luther King's assassination, his casket was pulled in a wagon pulled by mules. Okay, so there is, isn't that amazing, right?
So it's, okay, so given all that, it's less surprising that that speculation might have arisen in relationship to your analogy.
Right.
Oh, but things you find out too late.
I know. Yes. Right. So, but it is ironic because the mule is the symbol of the liberation from the oppression rather than the oppression.
Right.
So
okay. So let me ask you a question about strategy there too.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time strategizing with people because that was a big part of my clinical practice. But in terms of silence and then mustering your support network, right? And then you said, well, you can start your defense. It's like my sense is that a good offense is a very strong defense.
Yes.
Right? Because you can, if you're careful. Now, you can defend yourself or you can turn the tables. And I would say, if you're turning the tables because you're angry, that's not a good idea because you're going to make mistakes in your strategizing, right? I think you can distinguish the search for justice and truth from the search for revenge by the intermediating role of especially resentment.
Yep.
If you're resentfully angry, your head isn't clear.
Yeah.
But if you can quell that and you want to establish the truth and you can do that with a certain amount of detachment, then a good defensive strategy is offense. It's like what's actually, you can flip the table, so to speak. And the problem with a defense is there's something, something defensive.
There's something defensive about it. Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Well, I might have made a mistake. But
Right. Absolutely. Right.
No, you're seriously wrong.
Yeah.
And in a manner that's actually detrimental to the cause you purport to be putting forward. Yeah. Okay.
Well, so that and some of the prior experiences fueled what was then very early interests in left-wing authoritarianism and far-left radicalization and its consequences. And so I've been doing all sorts of studies on that.
All right, look, we have to stop this part of the discussion, even though there's like 50 other things I want to talk to you about, but we'll continue. I'm going to, I think, focus the discussion on the Daily Wire side. You guys listening on YouTube know about this, that we do another half an hour there. I think I'm going to talk about categorization and implicit bias and delve a little bit more into social psychology's role, for better or worse, in promoting many of the policies, the DEI policies, for example, and justifying them hypothetically on scientific grounds. I want to delve into that because it's definitely been social psychologists who've been particularly interested in the issue of implicit bias, even though to some degree that notion came from the clinical world, including from people like Carl Jung, who were very interested in the idea of complex and implicit association back in the 1920s. Anyways, there's a veneer of scientific respectability that's been laid over the diversity, inclusivity, and equity claims, the notion of implicit and systemic bias. And that's always bothered me because I think the social psychologists have done a terrible job distinguishing between categorization, which is like the basis of perception itself, bias, because you can't consider categorization bias. It's like, that's insane. That's insane, even though the postmodernists really do make that claim. And Lee's done work too, looking at the accuracy of such things as so-called stereotypes, because what's the difference between a stereotype and a category? Like that is a hard question. You could spend 1,000 years trying to figure that out. Anyways, I think that's what we'll delve into if you want to join us on the Daily Wire side. And so thank you very much, sir, for offering what you know and also your story to the more general public. And join us on the Daily Wire side if you want to continue with the discussion.